The courts have held up very well. I think they've shot down 38 of Trump's lawsuits. But had it not been for a series of a small number of state Republicans who went against what the president was urging them to do, who went against what their party often was telling them to do, and actually chose to certify results or not entertain or indulge arguments about voter fraud, it could have looked somewhat different. Or is Neil's sort of benign sense that the system worked actually the right way to look at it?
Well, I think both are true, if I may. If I can offer an Anglican view very briefly, I think that Neil's right, and I think the premise of your question is right. The rule of law has held, just barely. But that's what human governments do, right? The framers understood that most of what we would want to do would be bad. I'm a adherent to the notion that the Constitution is fundamentally a Calvinist document. It assumes that we're sinful and fallen and frail and fallible. And so we are checking and balancing our appetites and ambitions. And in extremis, which is where many of us, including me, believe we have been in the last 3 years or so, 4 years or so, there were people who stood up and followed the rule of law, which is essential. And in the line attributed to Churchill, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing once we've exhausted every other possibility. And we came awfully close there. I do believe that this was an election that, in my mind, has restored a conversation that dominated American politics between 1933 and 2017. And it was a figurative one between a position largely defined by by FDR and by LBJ on one end, and on the other end by Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. And that every president through Obama governed as part of that conversation. The last 4 years have not been a sequential chapter. I believe that a Biden presidency will be a sequential chapter to that historical conversation.
Two different things. One, he thought Trump would fade away, but that a lot of the ideas he represents were very powerful. I actually am more inclined toward that view, that Trump's brand of conservative, socially conservative, nationalist populism has remade the Republican Party. And that I wonder whether the conversation you were talking about sort of essentially less government or more government, is the big conversation. The Republican Party seems to be now the party of Josh Hawley and Marco Rubio and these people who are less interested in balancing the budget and cutting government spending and more about being anti-immigrant, anti-China, anti-trade. Is that the future of the party?
Well, unfortunately, it may be the future of American politics, where culture and identity are at the center, as opposed to more rational policy choices about which reasonable people can disagree given their understanding and interpretation of data and circumstance. I think President Trump is the fullest manifestation of perennial, not just American forces, but human forces. Nativism, isolationism, all the isms that George W. Bush talked about in his last State of the Union, the populism that Neil was talking about, isn't going away. It never has gone away. It's been with us from the very beginning. We had our first Make America Great Again election in 1800, when Thomas Jefferson wanted to return us to the principles of 1776. So that was 24 years in. And I think, as Arthur Schlesinger, our mutual friend, used to say, the future outwits all of our certitude. I don't really think there's any way to know what's going to happen to President Trump. He could be Joe McCarthy, fading away. But he also has done something that no other American politician ever did, which is come in from the outside, take over a party, rise to the pinnacle of power, and govern for 4 years. And 74 million people or so looked at the last 4 years or looked ahead 4 years in fear of a caricature of the Democratic Party and said, yeah, we want more of that. So we are a 51% country. Donald Trump understands that intuitively. And I think that we are in a political, cultural moment, as Doris was saying, where the independent contractor the independent actor, the disintermediated figure, as David Bondrelli argued so brilliantly 4 years ago. Donald Trump is the disintermediation of American politics. And that's a cultural, economic, political reality. And I think what you're seeing with the Republican Party right now, with the Republican leadership, is they're basically all participating in a kind of political hedge fund because they don't know either. They're hedging against Trump's ongoing influence or that of his children or his allies. You know, Trump has always been a franchiser. And so there may be Trump candidates as well as Trump towers around the country going forward.
All right, stay with that. Words. Is eloquence enough? We had a very eloquent Democratic president not so long ago, Barack Obama, and Mitch McConnell was pretty obstructionist. Haven't we seen this movie before?
Well, the thing about history, of course, is we've always seen these movies before. We just do all we can to make the ending happier, right? There was never a once upon a time in American history. There's never going to be a happily ever after. That's the nature of history. Rhetoric is about action. That's the original Greek of the word, Greek meaning of the word. And words matter, but words only go so far. You're exactly right. This is an enormously complicated challenge facing the incoming administration. I'd argue it's as complicated as, and Doris can check me on this, as 32-33. The good news, to some extent, is there is a tangible problem which can be addressed, the pandemic, and perhaps a competent, data-driven, reasonable response that manages to put the country back in a slightly more normal place will give him some capital to spend on other issues.
Neil,